prayer as well. She went down to Victoria to visit her daughter who was having surgery, and of course when she went there she was stuck down in lockdown in Victoria, and she thought, well, I can't keep surviving on nothing, so she's had to come back, and she's gone into 2 weeks quarantine in Howard Springs. So just pray for her. It's a bit of a change to be locked in a small room and not allowed to go out, so just pray for her. This morning, as we look at our topic this morning, I've called it Father at the Crossroads, and as I was preparing this, I was wondering and reflecting that in 39 years that I've done the Father's Day message, what could I speak on this morning that I haven't spoken on already? And the Lord gave me this message because I can see myself in it and many other men as well as we look at this particular passage, and I haven't preached on this at all either. And as I was thinking about it, there was this verse that is a challenge that men could learn, and it's this. Jeremiah 6:16. This is what the Lord says. Stand where the roads cross and look. Ask where the old way is, where the good way is, and walk on it. And if you do, you'll find rest for yourselves. But they have said, we will not walk on the good way. And that's a challenge for fathers to think about today. This verse is saying to us and to all fathers, stand at the crossroads of life and look. Stand at the crossroads and look. Because the crossroads of life is an important time when we make decisions, not just from external perspective, but it also includes the internal perspective as well. And this is something we want to explore this morning, because there are many things that are changing in our world. The last 18 months has shown us how quickly our world can change and how our life, well, what is the new normality? We really don't know. We're promised this and we're promised that. If we do this and if we do that, then we'll get some freedoms back. But is life going to be what it was before the pandemic? But there's new ideas, there's new paths that the world presents, and they challenge what the Bible has to say. And often you get confused messages. What is the Bible saying and what is the world saying? Particularly as parents and particularly as a father. And some of these changes, some of these ideas are not really progress at all. And not all things that demand change are good either. And there are just some things that the old way of doing things you just can't beat. There's a lot of wisdom in those ways. And it says there's an ancient timeless wisdom which cannot be improved on, and it will always be the best path to follow. Jeremiah's advice, when God speaks of the good way and he tells us to walk in it, he is saying it's not enough to see a good way and see that it's a good way. You must walk in that way or choose that path and make it your way of life. So in other words, you make a decision and you walk in it. And that's the choice that we have as fathers today and as individuals. As we come to the crossroads often in our lives, which path do we go? Who do we listen to? What advice do we take? Now, the first thing I want to look at is an attitude of insensitivity in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Because we're going to look at a fellow who was, well, he was a Christian. He's one of God's redeemed people. And his name was Eli. Who was Eli? Does anyone know? Does anyone care? Well, he was a priest. According to Jewish high priest, Eli was the fourth and youngest son of Aaron, the high priest. He served as a priest. He served as a judge in Israel for 40 years, which in itself was something unusual because usually the two offices, judge and priest, were separate identities. But somehow Eli managed to amalgamate them both in his life, and as a result it gives you an insight how busy he could have been with the activities of between the two jobs. We know nothing about his personal life. We don't know who he's married. We don't know if he was married. All we know is that he had two sons. Two sons. And this morning we look at his record as a priest, and we discover, in a spiritual sense, he was really incompetent in fulfilling his duty as a priest to the people of Israel. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we're briefly introduced to Eli, and it's only a brief mention of him in his role as a priest in dealings with Hannah and her prayer for a son. Now I'm going to put this up on the board and you can read it. This is the passage, 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 9 through to 18. And from this text, as you look at it, there's some things that we can take from it. Because here we have Eli sitting in his role as a priest. He's watching all the people come into the tabernacle. He's watching what they do. He's watching where they go. He's watching the things that they do. And so he's sitting there when Hannah comes in to pray for a son. And as he observed Hannah, he sees this woman in deep distress. He sees a woman who was crying because she made a vow to the Lord in her prayer for a son, in verse 10. Now, we need to understand that Hannah was making a passionate plea to the Lord to favour her with a son. And she vowed that if she had a son, she would make sure that he would serve the Lord in the tabernacle. That's how passionate she was to have a son. Her desire was intense. She wanted this son. She was pouring out her soul to the Lord. Now notice, she wasn't making a public spectacle of herself. She wasn't trying to draw attention to herself. This was a personal prayer between her and the Lord. And here we have Eli, who had been in ministry as a priest for many years. His function was to serve the Lord and the people. And here we have him sitting and observing Hannah. Now I want you to notice our text says he's an old man by this time. Some would say around 80, maybe a little older. And so he's not as sprightly as he used to be. He's sitting. However, he has difficulty in performing his duty. He has become comfortable in his position. He's happy to be known as the city's priest, and as such he'd gotten used to going through the motions associated with his function as a priest. And sadly, here he is watching Hannah, and he cannot discern between somebody who's earnestly praying and someone who's drunk. He could not discern the difference. In other words, here we have a priest with all the trappings of the office, but instead of the care and compassion that a priest is supposed to demonstrate to all people who come to the tabernacle, he's suffering from what I call the grumpy old man syndrome. You ever run into the grumpy old men? You know, they have some wear a black t-shirt with the words, "Beware, grumpy old man," or a hat that's got "grumpy old man." And that's usually an indication, you better be wary of this bloke because he's got a temper. So I called it the grumpy old man syndrome. Our text says that Eli had a clear view of Hannah. It says he actually watched her, saw her mouth moving, but no words were coming out. And so he assumed, he made a judgment call, she's drunk. That's what his assumption was. And to make things worse, he didn't go over to Hannah with the intention of finding out what she was doing. He didn't come beside her and whisper, "What is your problem?" No, he makes a big scene and he rebukes her of being drunk and asks her how long she's going to continue in this condition. That's a pretty good observation, isn't it? So really, as a priest, instead of giving the care and concern, what we find is he's rude, he's insensitive to the needs of Hannah. He assumed the worst about her, and so he decided to humiliate her by rebuking her. In other words, he couldn't discern between a person who is drunk and a person who's deep in prayer. Now, I wonder, would we be able to discern a person who's deep in prayer and someone who's drunk? What would give away the difference? Now, don't tell me here in Darwin you've never seen a drunk person. How do they react in their behaviour? They're quiet, submissive people, aren't they? They're loud, they're boisterous, they draw attention to themselves. Now, someone who's silently worshipping the Lord in prayer, how can you pick them? Simply because their behaviour is the opposite of someone who is drunk. Yet, here, Eli couldn't discern. So there's no reason, really, for Eli to lose his cool over Hannah praying to the Lord. She wasn't drunk. Now, as a priest who represented God to the people, he was responsible to show mercy and grace and compassion. He was supposed to come alongside them as much as he could and value them as human beings. His job was to aid, support, and help. Now, in defense of his position, maybe this was an everyday occurrence that Eli saw so often happening at the tabernacle, that all he saw was drunken women coming to the door of the tabernacle, and so he was frustrated by it, and that's why he resorted to his grumpy old man routine to deal with them. Maybe this was just a common occurrence that was happening at the tabernacle in that time. Now, keep in perspective, he is an old man. Now, I've got nothing against old men. I'm getting there myself. But he left the everyday running of the tabernacle to his two sons. And as we're about to find out, those two sons took advantage of these women who came to the tabernacle, and it's easy to see how Eli could make a mistake, that Hannah was just one of these women of low repute in the community that was coming drunk to the tabernacle. So it tells you and it gives you an idea of how bad things were when the priest couldn't discern between a godly woman and a drunken woman. Now, it brings a question to mind. Had Eli become so comfortable as a priest, he'd forgotten what prayer was like and what it needed to be. Maybe it's saying something more about Eli's own prayer life, that he was unable to see what prayer was when someone prayed to God for help and direction. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Pastor, you're a bit hard on this old man. Maybe he was just having a bad day, like we all do. But I beg to differ a little bit, because in chapter 3 we see how God spoke to Samuel in an audible voice 3 times, loudly enough for Samuel to hear a voice. And where was Eli? What was Eli doing? He was sleeping in his bed in the next room. And Samuel thought that it was Eli who was calling him. So he had to wake Eli from his sleep. And it was the 3rd time when Eli realized, it must have been God speaking to Samuel. So he told him what to do and what to say. And what then did he do? He politely rolled over in his bed and went to sleep. If Eli had been walking close to the Lord, he would have known the Lord was calling right away. And he would have been excited to find out what God had to say to Samuel. But Eli didn't. He went back to sleep. And God told Samuel that judgment was coming on the house of Eli, and Samuel had to tell him in the morning. So as we look at him as a priest, we can say this: he failed as a priest. Now, he belonged to the Lord. There's no two ways about it. But in carrying out his responsibilities, in caring for the people of God, he failed. Then we go to what I call an active incompetence. And in these verses, I'll put them up that you can follow there. In 1 Samuel there, chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. What we have is Eli is responsible for running the tabernacle. It was his job to make sure that everything was done the right way. If you like, the buck stopped with him. He was the head honcho, so to speak, in charge of everything. And he had the responsibility of oversight. That means his job was to train all the priests. And so it was an awesome privilege that he had, a position that he was going to be held accountable by God. So his job simply was to make sure that all things were done properly, that the Lord was honoured in everything that was done. Now, into this picture came his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And when it came to his sons, he seemed to turn a blind eye to their activities as priests. Now, the custom of the priest with the people was that when a person offered a sacrifice, the priest servant would come along. When the meat was boiling, he would plunge a 3-pronged fork into the cooking pot, and whatever he brought up would be his. Now, you might think, well, that's not bad, Pastor. It's not much. Now, every resident, every person who lived in Shiloh was responsible to do this. So if you imagine 200 people all bringing their meal, that's not bad. And so it's a procedure that the priest applied, and out of it, they got a pretty good meal. Now, it seems also this was unique to the tabernacle at Shiloh. In other words, this is the only place where this practice was implemented. In essence, it was something, if you like, the priests had cooked up between themselves, and Eli would have given his blessing for it to be put into practice. And by employing such a practice, the priest didn't endear themselves to the people. They were indeed guilty of robbing the people and robbing God of what was due to him. And why do I say that? Because God had already instructed the people what they required to bring. So here, the priests had overstepped their authority by what they were requiring of the people. But you know, things got decidedly worse. The priests badgered, bullied, and threatened the people by taking what was offered to God. They were intent on taking the best and choicest pieces for themselves. So really, when you looked at the priesthood, what would you say about it? They're a corrupt bunch. And yet this group represented God. And really they represented themselves. From Eli, the top, down through his two sons. And yet the buck stops with one person. The high priest could have changed all of this. But it shows he participated in this event. I don't mean he went out and got the meat himself, but he was a recipient of the practice. He got a lot of meat. And so he endorsed the practices of the priest. And the people, well, they were not real happy with what it had. But you know, it says he'd grown old and fat. He'd grown old and fat and was comfortable with this indulgence of food. And what it shows me here in the carrying out of his duties was an active incompetence to provide the spiritual oversight and administration of the tabernacle. And everybody who was under his authority, he let them do their own thing. So he failed in his duties as a priest. So it's something that we can see consistently. He indulged in food. He became comfortable. He allowed things to progress. He allowed his sons to have free rein. And then there's an attitude of what I call an attitude of indifference. And as we look at the scriptures once again there, as you follow them there, he's shown himself incompetent and sensitive to the needs of his people, and he fathers a priest. But I want to make this point plain. He also failed as a parent. And by that I mean he showed complete indifference to his sons in the way that he allowed them to get away with anything they wanted. He didn't pull them up. And you're going to say, well, Pastor, he did. Well, I'm going to address that. Now, what do I mean by when I say that he's indifferent? What does it mean to be indifferent? Doesn't care? Well, he probably does care, but he couldn't be bothered. He's an old man. They're not little boys. They're grown men. And so the idea of indifference is he has a lack of feeling, emotion, interest, or concern for something. And in this case, it was his two sons. He turned a blind eye to their activities, even though he was aware of their escapades. But he tolerated their conduct for many years without taking any steps to confront and deal with them in a way that they would understand. He just let them go. He saw firsthand their handiwork in the bullying and intimidating worshippers. He saw firsthand how they arrogantly took whatever they wanted and did whatever they wanted without any fear of repercussions from their father, but most importantly, without any fear or repercussions from God. They thought they were sweet. Eli had many character faults and flaws. But you know what? He did know the Lord. Our text says this was not the case with his two sons. They didn't know the Lord and had no intention of doing so. That's rather unique, isn't it? His father, being a high priest in the tabernacle, here's his two sons serving as priests of the Lord in the tabernacle who didn't know him, had no intentions of knowing him. In the Hebrew language, they were, the word that comes through, they were the sons of the devil. Now that's pretty harsh. They're supposed to be serving in the Lord's temple, and here they're called the sons of the devil, showing how corrupt and worthless they had become. They were thugs. They lived for the moment. They did whatever they wanted without any thought of repercussions for their actions. They respected no authority but their own. They were untamed, wild, and hated any restrictions placed on them. Wow. Now that could explain our society in the way that it's going today. But even though Eli was an old man, he couldn't but help hear about what his sons were doing. Because what they were doing was affecting the whole community. And the community was talking about them, and not in a good way. They were bringing the tabernacle and God into disrepute by their actions. And you know what? These two young men didn't care. They didn't care. They had made the entrance to the tabernacle into a brothel, where they took advantage of the women who came there in return for sexual favours. So it shows you how bad the tabernacle was when the two leading priests, if you like, were engaged in this sort of behaviour. Now, how then should Eli, as a high priest and as a father, what do you think he should have done? What would you have done? Well, you would have thought they would have grown up knowing the Lord. But here he is, over 80 years of age, and they're young men, I would say in their late 30s, early 40s. What can an 80-year-old man do with two sons that are in their 35 and 40? It's a bit late to start disciplining them. But really, he should have been able to take a strong stand and remove them from their office as priest. He could have done that. But instead, he tries to make them see reason about their actions and the impact that they're having on the tabernacle and the people they served. So his strategy is to make the boys aware their actions do have consequences. That what they were doing was not to be taken lightly. It was no laughing matter. It was serious. He's basically telling them, you better wake up yourselves and take note and stop doing these things. Now, it shows that Eli understood just how bad things were. He understood that his sons were getting away with blue murder, if you like. And he's also inferring by what he says here that their actions were unforgivable. In other words, they didn't have enough reasons to justify what they were doing. Now, I applaud Eli for confronting his sons here. It was the right thing to do. And what he said was right as well. But he needed to take a stronger stand to get his message through than what he did. He was a high priest. He was responsible for the tabernacle and all those in it. He should have just removed them completely from the offices of a priest and banned them from the tabernacle. That would have sent a strong message. Actually, if he had acted according to the law, what could he have done, or what should he have done? He could have taken them out and have them stoned to death. According to the law, that's what he could have done. But you know what? He had a blind spot when it came to his sons. He tolerated them more than he tolerated Hannah in her prayer to the Lord. He rebuked her badly and loudly, but here his sons, no. His sons were responsible for what they had done, but you know what? Eli played a part in the way they turned out. He failed to set boundaries for them. He allowed them the freedom to do whatever they wanted without facing the consequences. How do I know that? Well, our text, how does it say that these boys responded to their father's little pep talk? It says they refused to listen or take heed to anything their father said. In other words, they just dismissed their father's advice as ranting and raving and then continued to do whatever they wanted. As a result, the Lord is determined that they would die for their sins. So as a parent, what do we give Eli? He failed as a parent. So his father's a priest, he's failed as a parent. We go on then, and acquired inheritance in 1 Samuel 27 and 36. I'll put that up so you can read it here. Now, it's a sad end to this account when Eli fails to take the appropriate steps to discipline his sons because God stepped in and did it for him. Eli was told, because of his reluctance to do what was necessary and what was right, then as a result, his whole household would bear the consequences as well as the nation for the activities of his son. In other words, this wasn't just a one-off occurrence. This was something that happened over a number of years, and enough was enough. God was going to step in and discipline the whole household, and it would have severe ramifications for the descendants of Eli. Now, to get that, I'll put this up so that you can read it. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10 to 18. And it says, the Philistines fought Israel was defeated. They all ran home. The slaughter was very great, 30,000. No, that's not the one that you've got there, is it? No, that's the ones continued on with verses 37 to 36. So as you move on in this one here, you'll see that Israel was defeated. They all ran home. The slaughter was very great. 30,000 foot soldiers from Israel fell in battle. The ark of God was taken. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed. On that day, a Benjaminite ran from the battle lines and came to Shiloh. His clothes were torn and dirt was on his head. When he arrived in Shiloh, guess who was there waiting? Eli. What was he doing? Sitting on a chair. Sitting on a chair as a lookout on the side of the road. He was worried about the ark of God. As the man entered the city, he gave his report. The whole city cried out. When Eli heard the outcry, he said, "What is this commotion?" The man quickly came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old. His eyes looked straight ahead. He was unable to see. The man said to Eli, "I'm the one who came from the battle lines just today. I fled from the battle lines." Eli asked, "How did things go, my son?" And you get the rest over the page. The messenger replied, "Israel has fled from the Philistines. The army has suffered a great defeat. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were dead. The ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of the covenant, Eli fell backwards from his chair beside the gate. He broke his neck and died, for he was old and heavy. He had judged Israel for 40 years. So you get a picture. It's not a very nice one, but this is a picture that captures it, that information. What we have is Eli allowed his indulgence in the better things of life to get the better of him as a person. Indulgence is wanting things to be easy and comfortable. By that, indulging in the luxuries of life to excess. Eli had allowed himself to get fat and lazy. That's what the scriptures say. He allowed himself to get fat and lazy. In other words, he liked his food. And he allowed his sons to provide that indulgence. And when you read about Eli, he's either sitting or sleeping. In other words, Eli is not your action man hero. He's not in there. He's not fighting. He's not actively involved. He's sitting, eating and sleeping. He loved the position that he had, but not so much the responsibilities that came with it. And it played out in the way he died. Once again, he's sitting by the roadside waiting for the news, only to be told his two sons had been killed, the Ark of the Covenant taken by the Philistines. On hearing that, he fell backwards from his seat and broke his neck, for he's old, fat and heavy. Now, I don't expect a 98-year-old man to be fighting a battle, literally. So he's sitting in his seat of authority in a public place while neglecting the duties of his office. As a high priest, where should he have been? Back at the tabernacle, supervising and organising and meeting the needs of the people that are there. Here he is sitting on the side of the road, waiting for news. He was morally lazy, physically inactive, and emotionally indifferent to the wickedness of his own sons. He lost his spiritual passion and desire. He wasn't there for Israel in a time of need. What might have been if Eli had made the right decisions in life? What a different story it might have been. But alas, it's not. God judged Eli's household for his actions. Never again would there be a descendant that would serve as high priest, and never again did the ark of the Lord return to Shiloh. That was the punishment. So there's a price to be paid. So in this he failed even as a person. He looked for the easy way, the comfortable way to do things. If Eli had his time over again, I'm sure he'd do things differently. But his time at the crossroads of life, he had it, where he had to make the important decisions about which path he would go. And the choice he made affected his whole family and the community in ways that he failed to appreciate and understand. And this verse really is worth another look. This is what the Lord says: stand where the roads cross and look. Ask where the old way is, where the good way is, and walk on it. If you do, you'll find rest for yourselves. But they have said, we'll not walk in a good way. And I wonder this morning, here as a message to fathers, are you standing at the crossroads of life and wondering, what should I do? Wondering which direction I should go? Because life is always changing. There's always many challenges. And we don't always have the answers. But we have to make those decisions. And what we do affects not just us, but our families and the rest of the community as well. Eli failed to understand that. And I think sometimes he had to make decisions, but he did it on the basis of how he felt. And often today, we don't like to do the hard yards as fathers. We just don't like to do the hard yards. As you get older, it's very easy to pull out your grumpy old hat and be grumpy all the time, and you just dismiss as a grumpy old man. That you're too old, and people dismiss you. And as a result, nobody pays attention. But often, like Eli, we like to indulge and make things easy. We like the easy way out, where, we don't have to exert ourselves too much or make too many hard decisions that will affect us. We take the easy road out. But Jesus gave this challenge to many here in Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38. Then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his followers. He said, if people want to follow me, they must give up the things they want. They must be willing even to give up their lives to follow me. Those who want to save their lives will give up true life. But those who give up their lives for me and for the good news will have true life. It is worthless to have the whole world if they lose their souls. They could never pay enough to buy back their souls. The people who live now are living in a sinful and evil time. If people are ashamed of me and my teaching, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes with his Father's glory and with the holy angels. So basically what Jesus is talking about in life, and he does talk about it in the scriptures, they make it very clear. We get to the crossroads in life, and there are two roads to go. And the scriptures speak of a broad way and a narrow way. And one commentator has made these observations. And he says, men today are looking for fulfillment in life, but often instead of finding fulfillment, they find futility, because they find themselves not on the right road, but indeed on the wrong road. Jesus said there are two roads in life. One is a broad road, and it has many people on it. The other is a narrow road, and there's very few people on it. The broad road is a road into the hearts and lives of men and women mostly. It's wide open, it's broad, it's expansive. There's no confinement. It is an anything goes on this kind of road. Anything can go, anyone can go. There are many on this road. On this road are people who decided to live their lives their own way. They decided that they're going to be their own boss and they're going to live for themselves. They have the conviction it doesn't matter how you live or where you go or what you do, as long as you get there in the end, you just enjoy life. This is the pursuit of this world with its pleasures and its power, and it doesn't include God. It's living for self, it's living for personal fulfillment, rather than living for significance, living for success, and perhaps even enjoying the accolades of success. There are many people who are on this road that look very good. There are people on this road who say, I don't need God. I'm doing perfectly well, thank you. And they live their lives without God. They live their lives for themselves. They have no time for God, no time for spiritual things. They live for the moment, for the here and now. It's what you can taste. It's what you can touch. It's what you can feel. It's what you can see. That's all that matters. There's no thought about heaven or the life of beyond, just living for the here and now. Men are at the crossroads today because there are people on this broad road who have been seduced by the world, who are trying to live in two worlds at a time, and they end up miserable in both. They're miserable sitting in church. They're miserable at their work. And why? Because they're trying to live the best of both worlds, and they find it's not all it's cracked up to be. There's a price to be paid for where you want to go. But there's a right road. It's a crossroad. It's a narrow road. It says, pick up your cross and follow me daily. The broad road is crowded. And here's the crossroad to the narrow road. And the crossroad is tight. It can be constricting. There are boundaries on the crossroad. There's a narrow purpose. And that narrow purpose says to those who travel on the narrow road, pick up your cross and follow me. Now, what does that mean? Pick up your cross and follow me. That's what Jesus told his disciples and those who would follow him. Pick up your cross and follow me on the narrow road. But to pick up your cross means surrender. It means sacrifice. Don't think that your cross is just something you must bear. Your cross is something you must take up. You must voluntarily choose to pick it up and keep picking it up. And Jesus said you're to do this every day. It is the cross of surrender. It is the cross of giving up self rather than living for it. And today, as men, as fathers, we're at the crossroads in our lives today. And what we do with Jesus Christ will determine not only our destiny, but the destiny of your children and your grandchildren and their grandchildren. And Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. Don't be like Eli. He failed as a priest. He failed as a parent. He failed as a person. Now, it means that as parents, we do make mistakes. And as fathers, we do make mistakes. But we need to understand that they have serious consequences. And if we are like Eli, too indulgent and like the easy way out, we're going to tolerate a lot of things that our children do because we just can't be bothered. We're too busy, we're too tired. We take in the ideas and thoughts and philosophies of this world that we failed to be the parents that we should be. Eli did, and yet he was a believer. He served the Lord. He loved the Lord, but he chose when it came to his children to turn a blind eye to their activities. As fathers, we cannot do that. We are responsible and will be held accountable. And so this is my message to myself this morning. Don't be like an Eli.